I would like to thank Professor Pallis for taking the time and coming today to discuss for a super important topic for the overall logistics sector. And actually, let me hit the record button before I continue. Yep. So today, Professor Pallis is going to give us a presentation about COVID-19 and maritime supply chain disruptions and adaptability. It's a super important topic, as I said, for our sector. And I'm really looking forward to his views and findings and the information he's going to share with us. Just to give you some background information about Professor Pallis, is a president of the International Association of Maritime Economists. He's a professor in port economics and policy at the Department of Shipping, Trade and Transport at the University of Aegean in Greece. He is the vice chair of the Port Performance Research Network and the founding member and co-director of Port Economics. He has co-authored the books European Port Policy Towards a Long-Term Strategy, published in English, Japanese, and Greek, Common EU Maritime Transport Policy, which is published in English and Greek, and Maritime Transport, the Greek Paradigm, published in English. Thanos is currently the chief transport economist in the UN program on COVID-19 implications on transport, connectivity, and trade, and a member of the International Association of Ports and Harbors Risk and Resilience Committee, for which he co-authors the World Ports Barometer report. I suppose you can understand that Thanos has a lot of knowledge, which I'm very pleased to be here with us and share his insights. So, Thanos, floor is yours. Thank you very much once again for the great honor to come and speak to us.
Hello, good afternoon. It's an honor being here with you today. I would like to thank Stavros, but also the university, the department, and CLT for inviting me today to share some thoughts and some findings from an exercise that we developed in recent times regarding the implications of COVID in our lives, and especially in maritime transportation and supply chains, the related supply chains. I don't know whether we can see the presentation. I'm just starting with the technical part for a second, but I hope that we are fine. So thank you also for the introduction. And today we're going to discuss. I'm going to present some findings from two studies that Stavros already mentioned in the context of the UNCTAD, the UN, and UNCTAD in particular on maritime supply chains and how they have been affected by COVID and the ways so that they have tried to adapt. And without further ado, I would say that we need, let's say, a view at the background and where all started. Things in global trade were going quite okay in, let's say, at the half of the decade that has just concluded. And we had some positive trends in 2017 to 2018.
No, sorry for interrupting you, but we're seeing just a blank screen. I don't know if others can see something else, but I'm just having a blank screen in front of me.
You have a blank screen? Oh,
it's blank, it's white.
It should be from my side. It is the first light.
Okay.
It's white.
I can see your cursor moving around. It's funny because we tested it earlier. Yeah, I can see you're drawing stuff.
Sorry.
That's fine.
Let me retry. Do you
yes,
see
perfect.
Now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much.
Sorry, apologies for that, but you know, we are all used to Zoom, but not always ready to perform. But anyway, I was just saying that we started everything started a year ago. It's already a year plus. It was 15th of March 2020 when COVID was declared a pandemic. And we had entered 2020 in, let's say, questionable fashion. We had a couple of good years for the world trade. But then we had 2019 where things were going not so great. We had trade that had fallen by 3% compared to the growth of the past years. Unfortunately, these problems proved to be the less important ones. We had the outbreak, and we have an outbreak that we still experience in many respects. And today, the meeting and the whole discussion is about understanding how this trend, these events have had an impact on the way that maritime supply chains develop throughout the past years, and what lessons we might learn for their future capacity to adapt and be able to respond to the situation. We had an initial shock, which has been of international trade, and I think that it's worth spending 2-3 minutes focusing on international trade. The initial shock, what happened in Q1, Q2 of 2020, once we had the outbreak of COVID, and once we had the pandemic, there was the case of a very sharp downtrend of both trade of goods and the trade of services. The blue trend refers to goods, and the red one to services. And we see that we had some, let's say, very deep declines. And then the situation improved progressively. And we have, in the beginning of 2021, we have some forecasts that things might not be so bad in the near future, at least, and as long as we can make some projections. The thing is that though that we had the very beginning has been really bad. It has been so bad that it was worse than the financial crisis of 2008-2009. In 2008 and 2009, we had a crisis which was very much internal to the system. And I think that this is one major difference this time from the previous one. In 2008, 2009, we had a financial crisis. Many things were really internal to the industries. And when we talk about the maritime sector, we had an overexposure to financial issues and a structural development that undermined itself and in certain respects contributed to the crisis. This time we had a crisis coming from outside. It was something that had not been predicted and was not part of a systemic problem within the maritime world. That said, we know that we have a recovery, and I would like to just conclude this tour on the trends of global trade and imports and exports, because we are going to talk more about a sector that is related to the trends of imports and exports. We have in recent years the idea that there is an increasing disassociation of the trends in maritime worlds, maritime supply chains, and the trends of GDP around the globe, but still there is a relation. There is some certain and considerable levels of correlations. We have seen something which is right now affecting the whole maritime world, but particularly container ships. We see, first of all, that there is an increasing demand since the last part of 2020 in North America, a growth mainly driven by the US economy. Imports are increasing here, and we have a strong demand from different places that has eventually been present in other regions as well, and that creates a growth in Far East and a growth in exports in particular. And we might all have heard that we have reached levels of congestion in certain ports, in certain areas of the US importing cargoes. So we had a situation which was a very deep downturn, and then as we speak, we experience the very opposite, a very dynamic growth following 1 year later. Actually, talking about supply chains, we can think of 4 different phases and 4, let's say, structurally and in all respects, different situations. We can talk about the first phase, which was a supply shock, and it lasted for a couple of months or more. January and March could be the first shock. It has been immediately after the celebration of the New Year in China, when global supply chains tend to go lower at lower levels because of the low levels of production and movements in China. But the case has been that we experienced the first phase where we had a supply shock, and that's one would expect, and that happened indeed when we started having the first lockdowns of the workforce, mostly in the exporting part of the world, and we had some very first shortages in key sectors, which fortunately did not last for long, but it was the period that we had the very first shock for 2 months. The second period that we will be able to identify, and I will provide some data that support that these phases approach, is a demand shock, and it was the period when the crisis expanded, and in most parts of Europe, but also North America, in the developing world, I would say, economies, heavily consuming economies, started. There was a season of operations in many sectors. We had the lockdowns of a large consumer base, and we had also the collapse to travel and tourism, when everybody was headed to the supermarkets for the basic goods. So we had a period that lasted from March to May, where we experienced the second shock, that was the demand shock. Adaptation followed for a period, and that was the period that the consumption was adjusting to the new conditions, less spending, less consumer spending, but at the same time spending on basic goods, and also trying to continue lives in several economies around the world. That a trend that developed in a way that started rebalancing supply and demand in the sense that demand was not so high, but also supply due to the several lockdowns and limitations to the economies was not at the production levels that used to be. And what we experience right now, it's a case of the divergence. It's a case that we have different economies with different patterns. We have, let's say, the European economies that try to identify themselves a way of operation. We have North America that has already started demanding more goods, but also other parts like Latin America and South America and Africa, where the process has not restarted yet. Several economies continue to face some lockdowns and some disruptions of the supply chain. Is it pure theoretical? That could be a legitimate question and a logical question. What we know is that if we go to the data, if we go and try to see what has happened with the seagoing vessels, we can see that these 4 phases that I described have been here. It's quite obvious when the first phase started. It was around the period. You can see here the black, the dotted black line is the one that provides the difference between the vessel calls that happened in 2019, which is the green light, and the yellowish one, which is the vessel calls that happened in 2020. And we see that the 4 phases have been here. The first one, which was the case of the supply shock, we had a phase that was followed by the difficulties in the demand and the shock of each of us and all of us collectively societies around the world, and that phase was followed by a phase of adaptation, where we started having, let's say, a return of several vessel calls around the globe, and where we stand here right now, it's the diverse situation that exists since, I would say, since October, November. It's the situation where we entered in many economies in the second wave, in the third wave, or whatever epidemiologists would call it, or would name it based on their own analysis. So these are the data, thanks to, and here a parenthesis, I think it's worth it, this data have been collected via AIS, so we don't have, thanks to new technology, we don't have to wait for long before having the official statistic and be able to analyze what happened in the past year. I mean, typically in the past, for this data, one would have to wait till November, October, or something like that, autumn 2021, to be able to detect what happened, when more, let's say, conventional forms of statistical collection would conclude. Thanks to the technology, we have more information, and we can also go a bit deeper, because we have a global view. And as you will see, the overall performance, we had a decline of vessel calls around the globe that stands at almost 10%. But this has not been even. And I think that this is quite interesting. We have Asia that performed really better than anybody else. It was a good start, and that has to be attributed to a good start prior to COVID-19. But at the same time, there was the case that we had a reaction that proved quite efficient in the case of the Asian markets, and especially the Far East. And we saw that the cargos kept moving after the very first phases. The adaptation process has been faster there. On the other hand, we can see that, that we, I want to quite fast, but here you can see that developed economies, whether that's North America, whether it's Europe, they experienced the worst decline, and also Latin America and the Caribbean. I referred a bit, and perhaps I could skip that if we see what has happened in the case of per quarter, what has happened in the globe. That's the pre-COVID period, quarter one, and you will see that in quarter one we had Asia that had started in a dynamic way, exporting everywhere, but all the rest had a problem. The major problem that was faced was faced by Europe and North America during the second and the third quarter of 2020. They faced difficulties they faced less, were visited by less calls. The ports of these particular regions were visited by less calls compared to the year before. It's the two regions, Europe and North America, and one is worth comparing with how well the Asian market performed by continuing exporting. A question would be, but how come they keep having trade and all the rest go down? Intra-Asia trade is on the rise, and that's something that the observers had already reported happening since the middle of the 2010s, and this continued to operate once the economies there were, let's say, more open comparatively to what happens at the other parts of the world. They start moving cargoes via the different ports that are in use. It's interesting, and I think that I hope that you'll see at the bottom left, as we see, that developed economies performed really worse in terms of how much they were visited by seagoing vessels. It's developed economies that suffered most, comparing to developing and least less developed countries. So we have a different balance of the decline seagoing vessels in the different places. Although, in all cases, we have seen that we did not have, let's say, a disruption that ended at the stoppage of operation, but we had most of the times less cargoes and less vessel calls. And another dimension that I would also like to present here is the fact that not all different types of vessels declined at the same level. We have the global around 10% decline, but then one might focus on the green cases, containers and LNG carriers, to different types of vessels that have experienced lower levels of decrease, and on the other hand, the worst case scenario, which the worst case scenario here is passenger ships, where we talk about people and the social distancing and the need for not moving around, plus the decision or the imposed decision or the need for cruise operations to cease around the globe. We had the decision of all cruise lines in April 2020 to cease operations. Several of them have not returned yet to the market. And that means that we have quite a number of different vessels that stopped. I see a couple of questions at the chat. I will return to them. Let's say a bit later once we advance a bit the discussion, the presentation. Because we are going to talk also about whether congestion was there in the European ports and so on. We will refer to that because we are going to focus a bit more on container shipping. That's the case, and we are going to focus a bit more on containers following this tour of. I think we have seen that. So let's go a bit on the containers. What has happened in the container, in the case of containers? We know that this time we have a different industry than the one that we had 10 years ago. Alliances are pretty present, and they are here, and they have managed their capacity using blank sailings. So the case is that following a period of blank sailings, here again we have everything that happened in 2020. We had blank sailings in the beginning, which that means that we had lower number of vessel calls, and these blank sailings resulted in this gap, a lower number, which is at the end of the year was just 3% lower in total in the case of container vessel calls. A hugely different performance than passenger ships, etc. The case is that we still, I mean, that's a good overview, but it's already here. I mean, I see here that the congestion problems that there is a question, for instance, in the chat about the congestion problems that we had in Europe and so on. The case is that when we look at the impact on vessels, we developed a barometer that monitors what happens in particular ports. I mean, going further than the overall statistics, because the overall statistics are great to give us the picture. But then the question is, what really happened in ports themselves? What is interesting to know, and what one can observe here, is that we have only, if one focus here, only 40%, only 4 out of 10 container ports around the globe faced some serious decrease of vessel calls. I mean, serious decrease bigger than 5%. So 40% of ports have been affected. The other ones faced a situation where, more or less, in the case of container vessels, the situation has been quite stable. And here we talk about the period. The observations here are from the beginning of the outbreak, week 15. The outbreak happened in week 12. The reaction was to measure what's happening was quite instant, and the whole situation, it provides this 40%. On the other hand, going to passenger vessels, we see that we talk about 80% of ports that host passenger vessels or ro-ro vessels had serious problems in terms of the sizes, in terms of the number of vessels that were calling. I will go to see what else happened. It was only a question of, okay, we just have fewer calls and we have, let's say, better managed capacity. We know that we didn't have a major decline of the calls because there has been a number of blank sailings. We had a number of blank sailings which was exercised by shipping lines. Here we see an example of the route from Asia to the United States. And we see that from February onwards towards until June, we have seen 5 months where we had double-digit blank sailings. A double-digit percentage of sailings was blanked, as the industry call it. Because the idea of canceling services and start utilizing better the capacity of the vessels that were operating. The presence of alliances did help this approach, and as a result, in conditions of some lower container volumes, we started having vessels. I will explain to you that with some data I will present that these are bigger vessels, better utilized. There have been some reports, and for instance, Journal of Commerce has reported quite a few cases where vessels were breaking records of utilization with the help of technology, with the help of better management of flows in the ports, and better storage and better loading of vessels. So the better utilization of the capacity, the fewer calls resulted in fewer calls, but with more cargoes, even in conditions of lower container volumes. You will see, and there are some further interesting data that support this conclusion, that we have this better utilization, which stressed quite a lot the ports, because it's let's say a structural change of the way that the operations take place. Before that, 2 points which are really important. The first one is that we have an increase in container, an increase in container freight rates, which, by the way, it's not balanced. It's something that takes place differently in different parts of the world. Once, if we see the one part that has increased, the part of the world, one trade route that has realized the major increases in container freight rates is South America, and then it's West Africa. We didn't have a major decline of vessel calls, but what we had is an imbalance that contributed in the lack of capacity of certain forwarders, certain shippers to conclude their operations. Let's take the example of South America. Several Latin American countries are still in comparatively heavy lockdowns. So process could not be easily concluded. The containers and the boxes were not empty to be repositioned, and that created a huge imbalance of the presence of containers and the clearance process of the different cargos. So, although we did not face what we had faced 10 years ago, which was the lack of vessels, the need for bailing out liner shipping companies in order to continue operate and avoid stoppages and interruptions of the supply chains, now have a different phenomenon. We have the capacity going, we have the cargos transported, but then the whole process was not really completed as one would expect, so timing as it had been foreseen. We have imbalances, we have different ways that freight rates have increased. The overall case is that they have increased all over the place, and that has resulted in some reports that competition authorities are not always happy with this trend, especially when they see that at the same time, as also mentioned in the chat, AP Meller has declared some very good profits. I read the other day that Hapag-Lloyd has tripled its profits in 2020, but the latest data that we have for all the big ones, I did with my colleagues some research. By the end of 2020, by the end of the half of 2020, by June, they had already some considerable increases in their profits. Shipping lines stayed operational. They managed to continue their operations. With the better management this time, they have seen an increase in their profits, but at the levels that now we have questions by port authorities. At least in the US, there are such concerns, and it seems like at the European case, there will be concerns by the European Commission on the competition and the extent that we have some difficulties with alliances. Parentheses, alliances have been excluded by competition rules via block exemption last year, or 2 years ago, I have to say. Having focused on what happened in the case of alliances, let's go a bit more on the port side. A major change that should not be undermined. We have there is a change in supply chains, and there is a changing pattern of the way that let's say motherships leave Far East to reach different places of the world, and the way that feeders connect with them, and how the whole network is operating. And when we had, following the initial shock, when we started having the case of more cargoes being transported, the adaptation period, we referred about the adaptation period, when May, June, July. So since the outbreak, we see that we have a considerable part of vessels going late to the ports. Schedule reliability has been an issue. I'm afraid I didn't have more global data to present today, but here we have two cases which are very different, the East and the West Coast in North America, and that in the US in particular, that provide evidently let's say a clear, obvious trend of substantial levels of delayed vessels. Vessels arrive late. And the second thing is that we can reach some conclusions by looking at the Liner Shipping Connectivity Index that is developed by UNCTAD since 2006. In particular, if we look at the components of this index, because it's an index widely publicized, but at the same time it has different components. The index itself, the Liner Shipping Connectivity Index, has increased. That's an index measuring the levels of connectivity of per port and per country based on the various components that you can see here. What has really happened? We have seen that the vessels that went out of operations following decisions of alliances, but one could say liner shipping, but it's in essence of alliances. It's the smaller ones, or the medium ones. We have seen an increase of the vessels, of the maximum vessel size that reaches ports around the globe. We have bigger vessels, and one can see that there was a trend in 2019. We went 2019, and we are here. We kept seeing increasing size of vessels. Somehow this increases a bit the capacity, but at the same time we have a lower number of services. It is here, it should be here, and a lower number of services and a low number of operators. The number of operators around the globe is lower, number of services is lower, direct calls remain the same, but the deployed capacity increases and poses challenges because we have ports being visited by bigger vessels that commonly arrive a bit late. I would like to cover one more theme, and that hopefully will give us some time for discussion. It's about, okay, how whether there has there been any capacity of the port industry to remain to remain operational, and what have been the challenges for them. What seemed to be the major challenge, and I think that this is part of a question that I read diagonally of as I was presenting here. This is a measurement of the hinterland transport delays that ports experienced comparing to normal situation. In the context of the International Association of Ports and Harbors, we developed a barometer where we measure the number of ports that experience some major hinterland transport delays. Here we have transport delays that are bigger than 5% or up to major ones. So once we had the COVID outbreak, and for a period here we received from week 15, a reminder that the outbreak was in week 12. Let's say that for a reasonable period of time, for a significant period of time, not reasonable, but significant, we had a number of ports facing delays. Long queues for cargos going to cross borders. And that's not uncommon in many different cases and in many different parts of the world as well. It's not only an African problem, it's not only a European problem, it's not only North American and South American problem, it's overall a global case. That the cross-border case has been difficult. The in and out of trucks from the ports, from the gate of the port has been difficult. The situation improved once we saw faster, I would say, than the cross-border crosses, because societies applied social distance and other restrictions that allowed the continuation of operations at local level. But you will see that also rail services in the beginning were disrupted. Here again, we had the cross-border crossing, which was a bit difficult. And also in the case of, we also measured barge services, which also faced some problems as well. Hinterland transportation has been the most difficult part of the adaptability and the building of resilience from a port perspective. Things have been easier, let's say not so difficult in the case of utilization or overutilization or underutilization, the capacities, the warehouses, the yards, any storage facilities that are available at ports. Here you will see that the scale is different. We talk at a very maximum of 30%, but for foodstuffs, the case of underutilization, let's say, of facilities has been low, less than 15%. And overall, whether we talk about very basic products or we talk about more, let's say, consumables or more luxurious ones, then we still do not have any major underutilization or overutilization. I don't have here a graph about overutilization, but the overall case is that ports did not face storage capacity. The problem that they faced was the flow of goods, the flow of goods to the gate, outside the gate, and towards hinterland. That has been the problem. And the initial shock, and that's the last part of this analysis, the initial shock has been there for workforce. In the beginning, when we had the outbreak of COVID, 30% of port authorities, the yellow one refers to port authorities, the 30% of port authority workers was not there. We had some initial disruptions, but very, very fast, you will see after a week to 5 to 8 weeks, we had workforce being there. Only 10% of the ports, you will see here from here on and further on, only 10% of the ports were facing some problems of shortages of workers. In the beginning, there was a problem with port authorities and administrative staff, people who have to be in the office, but then sanitary measures and adaptation and most of all teleworking, which has been a major trend and remains to many ports. Teleworking facilitated the adaptation. In the case of dock workers, we had some problems in the beginning. It was also the period that, in qualitative terms, we have reports that, let's say, shifts of gangs in ports have distanced themselves, provisions of social distancing during the operations have been applied, cleaning of equipment, taking care of whatever is used and cleaned before usage by another worker. So we see that there has been an adaptation process, but both of them have been fixed. The problem has been a bit with truck drivers. We realized at a later stage that we need to see what happens with truck drivers going to ports. The initial shock seems that it has been adjusted here as well. Somewhere here you see that there have been some hiccups and some problems when we entered the second wave or the third wave, whatever it's called, and that was a problem. Let me head into the conclusions and just to mention what kind of measures we saw by happening and leading to the adaptability of the supply chain. We have seen operational adjustments by the port industry, which have been important. It was the idea that we had initially we had the reaction that, okay, let's create some fast lanes for essential services and let's move to reorganize the working conditions. Oh, sorry, the working conditions. It's the working conditions that change. And also the initial reaction of ports trying and their customers and shipping lines as well. Let's see what we can do paperless. And let's communicate to everybody that we move towards, even if we are not ready, towards a more digitalized process. And that has been something that contributed to transforming digitalization, not only to necessity, but also to the catchphrase and something that is every day in the words and the saying of everybody who's involved in maritime supply chains. The way that this happened, and that's the second important thing, is the coordination that has happened. We have seen that we had facilitation by several governments. That's not regional. We could spend time discussing about examples. there has been a top-down approach in many places, but also we have seen that those ports and those shipping lines had, but the bigger ports, the ones that had already plans of how to treat special situations, were the most effective ones. The third part that we saw and we realized was that many ports, because ports tend to be profitable, and they are profitable indeed, so that they behaved in a very, let's say, I would say personally advanced way towards their providers and users. When the dues of users were in effect frozen by ports, were not asking money. Several ports, and it's interesting to note that we observed cases in both the Europe and North America. They started paying their providers in order to stay in business. And although they had the potential of paying at a later stage, they start paying their providers so they would feel more comfortable with the cash flow, and because they are smaller providers, not as big as ports or not as profitable with ports, and that helped them. That created more problems for fully privatized ports. Obviously, several countries have ports that are, at least their management, not the operations, is at the intersection of the public and the private sector, and that created a different situation for privatized ports. And the most difficult thing has been the coordination of hinterlands. It's what I said before. It has been very difficult for orchestrating landside operations. What happens beyond the gate is very much a question of adjusting a number of policies and a number of stakeholders, which was not the case in all places. So that's why we face some difficulties. I will conclude. I will pass some more analytical discussion on this. And I will conclude with two slides. One slide is the very good trend. Here we see a survey of the trends in port investments. Only 2% of the ports have decided to shelve investments that had been planned before COVID. All right, delays have occurred, and delays have occurred, either major ones or other ones. Major or minor delays, but the case is that we don't see the trend to postpone the investments that have been already planned. Everybody feels that there's going to be a rebound and things will go a bit better. Whether this will happen in a very different framework, that's to be found. There is a potential of a major reset of the logistics sector. We need to be, let's say, to be calm and see whether this might happen. Workforce might have changed forever in a very teleworking and a very different organizational structuring. What might happen in the service sector is need to be found out, but we know that it's very more vulnerable than has been assumed, and then we have to see whether will be the scale effect of different businesses, but also what might happen in the case of demand, and to what extent e-commerce and automation are here to stay for long, and at what extent this acceleration will be soon the dominant, let's say, trend rather than a trend among others. I would say that's a bit early to say. Obviously, it's of interest to all of you and to all of us. I try to explain this presentation, what has happened in shipping lines, ports, and vessel calls around the globe. And I would be really happy and pleased to discuss further your questions and your thoughts on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Tana, for the extremely interesting presentation. You know, it was really eye-opener with some up-to-date stats. Any questions, guys? Tony, please.
You can always trust me to ask a question, Steph.
I also have a lot, but I don't want to dominate the discussion.
Well, one of the things that I found really interesting as we were going through the COVID pandemic, and I put a little comment, it was more a comment rather than a question about the congestion in ports, but we also saw this phenomenon that we haven't seen for a number of years, particularly here in Europe, of rapidly increasing freight rates, box rates coming out of the Far East into Europe. I mean, we saw some unprecedented box rate prices coming forward that we haven't seen for years and years and years. Now, I noticed on your graph, Professor, that it seemed to be starting to tail down in more recent months. Do you think that's a sign that we're going back to the normal dog-eat-dog world of the shipping line, where price becomes really very volatile, and shipping lines have a tendency to force through general rate increases only to follow them by undercutting each other over the next 3 months and completely eroding the general rate increase? So do you think we're back to that world of volatility, and that some of the differences that we're going to see in the rate of pickup in different economies as we come out of the pandemic is going to fuel that process?
I would say if I can go ahead, I think that, okay, the way that I presented it, it was more the idea of stressing the regional disparities. The case is that we don't have indications that rates return to the pre-COVID normal, let's call it this way, normal level. We have, first of all, beyond the surge of the demand, beyond the absence of containers due to the imbalances that were created in recent months, which might eventually, let's say, be addressed, an issue that might be eventually addressed. We have another thing which is quite important. As I mentioned, that the blank sailings and the handling of alliances of the capacity that they use is, for the moment, we have fully loaded vessels, and we have vessels going around fully loaded, creating problems, specific days, specific periods of time in ports, but also making hard for many shippers or forwarders to find out how to ship their cargoes. Will be an adjustment. More and more, we read people feeling a bit uncomfortable with this, let's say, blank card that beyond the blank sails, they have blank card alliances to operate as they wish. I mean, personally, I read every day more and more reports. We need to rethink of competition laws and so on.
Thank you, Thana. Peter?
Can you tell me how much slack there is normally in the system? For instance, obviously you might have ships that are laid up. You might go from super slow steaming to ordinary speed. How much of that is there? Also, in the case of the ports, I know there can be problems with certainly US West Coast ports, but in general, is there much, in an ordinary world, is there much slack around, and how much of that can be utilised?
So I'm afraid I didn't hear well the question. Sorry
for
this. Yes.
Okay. How much slack is there in the system? For instance, ships might be laid up. They might be having slow or super slow steaming, which obviously you can go to faster steaming. Mm-hmm. I know that some of the ports, particularly West Coast US, can be very congested, but there's normally a lot of slack in the port. So can the system generally cope with increased demand, or is the system not? Well, basically, also how resilient is the system?
I'm afraid, yeah. The case of, I was going to say that I don't have statistics available regarding slow steaming, but we know that this is not an issue anymore. It's not the case that that it's more the capacity handling, which is the priority, rather than reorganizing our let's say our accounts based on the difference in the slow steaming strategy. So it goes more on the capacity utilization, I would say. But I have to admit, on the other hand, that we have not gone into statistics on that. The cases, and the interesting dimension, which is indirectly to your question, but I think that it's something to monitor, is one needs to think that next to what is happening operationally, because of COVID, we have the decarbonization debate right now. And even if I'm right, which I said, I feel less comfortable to put it in a very deterministic way, even if I'm right and there has not been an effect on slow steaming or on the strategies to expand slow steaming, we have another debate which is coming, and it's IMO and decarbonization and the way that steaming will operate in the near future. And that will bring additional dimensions in the discussion, certainly.
Okay. So is the problem more with ports than with the actual ships then, in terms of capacity?
It's the problem. The depends on what port. The congestion right now, it's more a port's case to handle fewer calls with more cargo right now. And not only it's on the question of ports. One thing that it's also not well documented, because I don't know if it's. The statistics say that in 2021, we have already more accidents than we had in a year in 2020 or in 2019. In what sense? Accidents in terms of containers going into the water rather than to the final destination. And the ITF, which is the International Transport Workers Federation, talks about fatigue of workers on board. And then there is a question of, okay, technology facilitates a better queuing of an order of boxes on board. But then when we do that, have we taken care of what naval architecture tell us about the stability of the vessel and so on? Or it's just more mechanical and so on. So we have a pressure now to the system, and 12% in a quarter. I mean, in the beginning, we saw some numbers of the GDP of the exports of China. It's 12% increase. So there's an enormous pressure in the system. When the flow has not been, the loop is not concluded properly, because there are several buffers here and there, because the economy does not work, because this port does not perform, and this economy does not consume, and so on. So the loop does not conclude properly. And there's an enormous pressure to send out cargoes.
We have seen a couple of questions coming. Liz, do you want to ask something? I've seen you have unmuted yourself.
Thank you, Stavros. Yes, Professor Panis, this is really interesting. It's been some of the questions that myself and colleagues were really interested in exploring, giving the kind of information we're getting from industry about port congestions and all those issues. My question is really more as a prediction. With the movement of alliances increasing and the pressure on operating bigger sized vessels, because they seem to have done much better across the range, do you foresee bankruptcies in the sector?
No, I wouldn't say. I would say, first of all, thanks for the kind words, for the presentation. What I think is happening right now is that we have some really powerful alliances that perform well and make, as I said before, they make profits which had not been seen before. I mean, the levels are impressive. It's more probable to see the takeover of smaller shipping lines. There have been already a couple of announcements in the beginning. I referred before to Hapag-Lloyd that already decided to overtake a company in Africa. They are looking for other smaller lines. The case is that I mean, but here we are under the the forecasting or the predictions game, I think that it's more probable that we will see at some point competition authorities feeling really uncomfortable with what is happening with shipping lines that have control the supply chain with their practice. That's more probable than seeing shipping lines going bankrupt, like we saw Hanjin, which went down eventually after the 2008-2009 crisis.
Thank you.
And I have to say, if I may interrupt a bit the process, because I see here that Michael Rowe is here. We started our discussion today with, before the meeting, I was explaining to Stavros that I was really close when I was younger to be in Plymouth studying for a PhD, because there was somebody who offered to me the potential of developing a PhD at Plymouth. That was Professor Rowe back in the early 1990s. Unfortunately, I found a scholarship somewhere else, and I ended in Bath, but still my part of me is in Plymouth, thanks to Michael Rowe, and I'm very pleased to see him around here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Any quick final questions for Thanos? I'm just conscious about the time. You know, it was a very enlightening presentation, Thanos. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah. Thank you.
My honor.
One last from me. Are we going to have the slides, please?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I can definitely share them.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Stavros, just before you close down, can I just add my thanks on behalf of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport to Thanos for what was a really fascinating discussion. Actually, we could carry on for another hour, to be honest, because the world of shipping in this really very bizarre time is absolutely fascinating. And that was a fascinating presentation. So thank you on behalf of all of the members of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, and particularly the regional committee of which Stavros is a member, that sought to organize this event. So thank you very much indeed on behalf of all of us.
My honor, thank you. It has been a pleasure, and looking forward to find other opportunities to meet each other, if possible, in person. Thank you.
For sure, Thana, we're going to keep that kind of discussion live. And definitely, when things are going to be allowed, we would like to see you here in Plymouth, so we can have some nice chats face to face. On that note, thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. Thano, it was a great session. It was really enlightening, as Tony said earlier on. We could go for hours. Great pleasure to have you here. It was my pleasure to host you as part of the business school and wearing the other hat of the regional chairman for Devon and Cornwall. Thank you, everybody, for attending the session today, and looking forward to the next one. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you.